Okay, Pop. What are you reviewing there?
Well, this is a scrapbook with some of my work on the Herald Tribune.
All right, let me come over there and take a look at that. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
This was the biggest scoop I ever had. I wrote a story without giving any credit to anybody, just stating it as a fact, saying that the Pope, for the first time in 2,000 years, was coming to the Western Hemisphere, and specifically to New York City. And when I started writing this story at 7 o'clock in the evening on the Herald Tribune, they started sending it out to our news service and other recipients, and then they pulled everything back, and they said, we will put in a fake story in the first edition about the storm Betsy. We'll fill this space with the storm, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, too late for the New York Times to catch up with us, we'll drop in the scoop. And that's the way it was done. This was the story as it appeared.
Wow.
And I flew to Rome and got on the Pope's plane with him, and then flew back to Rome with him. Editor and publisher, which was the news publication, wrote an article about this big scoop. The Herald Tribune tried to get the Pulitzer Prize for the scoop, but someone else got the prize instead. So you win some, you lose some.
Is that right?
And on the plane, the Pope said we could take his picture if we wanted to. So I, with my camera, went up and shot a picture. And then I said to him, would you be willing to go to Communist China? Because I was convinced that he was willing to go anywhere. And he said, yes. That's all he said. But it made a big scoop, another big scoop. The Pope hints at visit to Red China. That headline was not quite correct. All he was saying was, yeah, he'd go anywhere.
And that was on October 5th. Hold on a second, I can get the date.
1965.
All right, excellent.
He met with President Johnson and also Jacqueline Kennedy.
This is after John F. Kennedy was killed, but before Robert F. Kennedy was killed. Right between.
I think so.
JFK was killed in 63, and RFK was killed in 67.
Well, that's it. Then that's what.
Right between, yeah.
Then another story. Pope John the 23rd got to be 80 years old. So as president of the foreign correspondence in Italy, I sent him a message saying that we wished he would have a happy birthday, and why don't you come visit our press club in Rome and give us a press conference. Well, I knew that he wasn't going to do that, but to my surprise, the answer came back that, well, what you could do is come on over to the Vatican and we will, you can have a private conference with him, your foreign correspondents, and if you want to, you could give him a speech, but let us see beforehand what the speech is. So I wrote 2 minutes saying, why don't you improve your bad press relations? It took me 2 minutes to say it without being insulting. And the French correspondent said, well, it has to be in French because we are a very important country. So I said, okay,
Look over here, Pop.
take my 2 minutes and put it in any French you want, but my text is the one that you have to use. You can't change what I'm saying. And so when I finished, Monsignor Capovilla, his secretary, said to me, the Holy Father is, when he finishes, he's going to answer you. And when he finishes, you should say, please say something else. So I thought my colleagues are going to think I'm gone mad. Here we've been allowed to give him a speech. Nobody I ever heard of ever gave the Pope a speech. And now I'm supposed to ask for more, but I know that so I said to him at the end of in the 15 minutes, he spoke for 15 minutes, and in it he said, we know the world has changed, we know that you have instant access to world public opinion. We have to deal not just with the diplomats, but also with you, and from now on we will do so appropriately. And in fact, they did ask me later what I wanted. I said press conferences, and they did start having press conferences. Well, when he finished, I said in Italian, Santo Padre si può dire qualcos'altro. Holy Father, can you say something else? And he relaxed. He was no more comfortable in French than I was. In Italian, he said, oh, you newspaper people. I used to be one myself. And of course, he couldn't have said anything that would have pleased my colleagues more than that. I had a mixed bag of all kinds of people, including skeptics and agnostics, probably a few atheists, but he could have said nothing more to please them than that. And then he explained. He said, I was the secretary of my bishop up in Bergamo in northern Italy, and one of my jobs was to send items over to the diocesan newspaper. So I figure you could argue, stretching a point, that I was a newspaper man too. So it made a lot of publicity.
Interesting.
And this was interesting. There's a publication called Current Biography, and when I was about 45, they ran this big article about me, and it started off by saying, Barrett McGurn is one of the best known American foreign correspondents. And then it told the whole story about family growing up in Bay Ridge, and all of my news work up to that point.
Interesting. Good. A couple things that I wanted to, you were speaking about at dinner the other night. One of the stories I thought was interesting was your work in, I don't know if it was when you were in Moscow or in Rome, but the general who is sort of the founder of the CIA and your interaction with him. What was his name again?
Well, what you're talking about is just after World War II, one of the American correspondents was murdered. And this caused a lot of excitement in the news world back in the States because they were afraid it was a bad precedent and they didn't want American reporters to be bumped off just because they were in Europe as correspondents. So they sent Wild Bill Donovan, the founder of the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, they sent him to be present at the trial of the accused murderer. And the person killed was a friend of mine, George Polk. He and I had covered the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945. He was a fighter pilot in that war, but he was a civilian by that time, and he was working for CBS. And I was still in uniform as a correspondent for the Soldiers magazine, Yank magazine. So we got to know one another there, shared a taxi cab ride at one point, and later he came through Rome, and I said, "What are you up to?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to Greece for not less than a year, because you don't really know what's going on in less than a year, and not more than 2 years, because 2 years is enough to write a book." Well, he didn't write a book. When he got to Athens, he very indiscreetly started saying to anybody who would listen that he was frustrated covering the Greek Civil War, because all he had was the government's point of view, and he didn't have the point of view of the communist revolutionaries. And so one day when he was walking through Athens, a flower salesman on the sidewalk said, "If you'll keep your mouth shut, I'll see to it that you get what you want." And he was approached by an agent of the Communist Party that escorted up to Salonika in northern Greece, and they said, "We're going to take you through the secret passageway connecting the communist Greece from government Greece." Well, of course, that was perfect nonsense. The communist Greece was merely the hilltops where the communists were, and there was no secret passageway. All you do is climb up a hill and you were there. But he went along with it, and they said, "Now, as we go through the secret passageway, we're afraid that you will see the secret, and sometime inadvertently, certainly not out of anti-communism, will spill the beans, and the government will now know where the passageway is." So he said, "Okay, what do you want?" They said, "We have to take you in a rowboat out into Salonika Bay, pitch black, and we have to blindfold you, because that way you can't see the passageway." So he said, "Okay, blindfold me." They did, shot him in the back of the head, killed him, dumped his body into the bay, and first took out his credentials and gave it to the guy who had escorted him up there, and said, "Drop this into a mailbox in Salonika so that it's a signal that what's happened to him."
How do you know all of this?
Well, I knew him, of course.
But he wasn't able to tell you the story because he was dead.
Well, the story came out in the trial of the guy who had escorted him to Salonika.
Okay.
And that's where we heard all of what went on.
I see.
So the communist radio immediately said, "Look at that. The government has murdered George Polk. Here was a nice, honest, good reporter who wanted to see both sides, and what do? They go and kill him." So they were using his murder, accusing the government of being the murderer. And they said, "The United States is giving weapons to the government. The U.S. should immediately discontinue that." So it was really pretty high-handed tactics on the part of the communists. Well, I sat with General Donovan while the trial went on. I had my own interpreter, who wasn't very good, but he had one that was really excellent. So I just eavesdropped on the translation that he got. Later, I met him 10 years later in Athens, and he said, "Oh, you're still alive?" Well, he'd been thinking they were trying to save American reporters, and of course, I would be one of them. As it turned out, that nobody else was murdered.
And what did he say to you in terms of providing information?
Well, then he said to me, "If you run into anything that you think I should know, just to let me know in Washington. In other words, let me recruit you as one of the espionage apparatus of the United States. You can pretend to be an objective reporter, open and honest, but you can be a secret intelligence agent. I said nothing and never told them anything and never intended to, because I felt that I was extremely exposed. Everything I wrote had my name on it, day after day in the newspapers. I was not going to be anything but what I really was. I was not going to be an espionage agent. As a matter of fact, I couldn't have served the government better than in my reporting. However, at one point, after I'd been in Moscow for 3 months, I went back to Rome, and some fellow in the American embassy, undoubtedly a CIA operative, asked me to come see him. He said, "Now, just tell me what you observed when you were there in Moscow." I immediately froze. I'm not going to be anything more than I pretend to be, which is an honest reporter, not an espionage agent. Anything you want to know about what I saw in Moscow, you can read in my book.
Okay, go ahead. That's it? Good, perfect. Tell me about the time when you were in Moscow and they called you in for a little interview on some of your writings, and I think you had a little interrogation at that point.
Yes, it was quite an experience. I had written a story making fun of the dictator. Sovietskaya Rossiya, which was the Red Army magazine, had an article saying this is the 10th anniversary of the climactic Battle of Stalingrad, and we should realize that that was not really a military victory, that was a political victory, and the political commissar on the scene was Nikita Khrushchev, the current dictator. So I wrote a story saying we knew that the dictator was great, that he knows everything better than anyone else does, but this is the first time that we ever heard that he single-handedly won the Battle of Stalingrad. Well, I had arranged to take a trip out on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and when I came back, I had shared this with the Associated Press. They said, prepare yourself, you're going to have a session with the government. They had never sent the story, the censor had killed it. And so I was invited, or told to come to the Foreign Office, and when I got into the lobby, there was a line of policemen. They opened up, let me through, sent me to the second floor, where there was a second line of policemen. That place was really a special institution. And they opened up, closed behind me. Now I had 2 lines of police between me and the so-called freedom of Moscow. And they sent me into a room, and there were 2 guys sitting behind a desk and a chair in front of it. And I thought, when I was in the American Army, we had what we called the ARs, the Army Regulations, and in them, any possible thing that ever could occur to you were explained already in the Army Regulations. You didn't have to do any thinking, just consult the ARs, they'd tell you what to do. I thought, these guys undoubtedly have the same thing, and they had a book open in front of them. And I thought, one side says, if he admits he's wrong, sign him up to be a communist agent at their choice sometime in the future. That'll be his punishment. If he's defiant and insulting, this is the way you lower the boom on him. So I thought both of those pages are unattractive. What I'll have to do is go down through the spine, the split in the middle. So they harangued me. They said, it's terrible what you did. It would be, and it's out of our hands. We could be magnanimous and blink an eye at it, but we got a letter from plain old simple workers down at the census office saying, how do you let characters like this loose in the Soviet Union? Well, now, in our country, it's the plain, ordinary, simple workers who are in charge. And when they speak, that's it. So they've spoken and you've had it. So they said, now you have to say something, because I had decided not to say anything if I could avoid it. And so I said, I have not, nor would I ever, distort the news inside the Soviet Union. Well, they looked at one another. What page was that? Was that the was that the throwing themselves on our mercy and becoming an agent? Or was it outrageous defiance? So we have to lower the boom? So they looked in puzzlement. They didn't know what it was. And then they said, well, you forget this ever happened, and we will. And what they meant was, don't be so fresh. You've been warned. Don't go to your friends at the AP. Get a story out that the Herald Tribune correspondent has been threatened, and we'll leave it at that. And of course, I didn't say a word to the AP, because one thing I didn't want, I was only there replacing Bernie Cutler, who was the bureau chief, while he was on vacation. I didn't want my contribution to be the closing down of that bureau. There were only 15 American news agencies in Moscow, and that bureau was a commercial asset to any of the 15 that had it. And so, happily, I didn't damage the bureau.
Excellent, excellent. That was a story I wanted to get down, because we haven't talked about that one before. So that's a great one. The other, it's currently Summer Olympics are going on. The 2008 Summer Olympics. All the athletes are gathered in Beijing now, and the Americans are trailing the Chinese in the gold medal race. But I think in the overall, we still have a slight edge, but maybe that's changed today. Talk a little bit about your experience covering the Olympics.
Well, the Olympics came to Italy, I think it was 1956, if I'm not mistaken, and there were the Winter and Summer Olympics. The Winter Olympics alpine foothills in the northern part of Italy, and I covered it all alone for the Herald Tribune. And what I did was, each day I went to one of the sports, the ski jumping one day, another sport another day, sending off a story talking about what was going on in that sport. And that way, and meanwhile AP was counting all the gold medals, and so I could always freshen the story by borrowing from AP the count that they were keeping. And then in the summer, it came to Rome, and Stanley Woodward, who was the sports editor, was so grateful to me for what I'd done, one-man coverage of the Winter Olympics, that he tried to get an extra pass for me for the Summer Olympics. Jesse Abrams, who was our field and track correspondent, was there. He had one of the passes. And they said, no, you can't have an extra space. So the only thing I covered was the marathon out through the Appian Way, the ancient Roman highway that runs from Rome to Naples, because that didn't need any pass. But Jan was there covering attending those Olympics. We had just begun to see one another, and she had Lockie with her, And so we got together there at the Summer Olympics.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that would have been 56. That's right.
Right.
That's great. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, you had a story about Joe DiMaggio. Tell me that.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that because now I've learned that Joe DiMaggio was one of the great athletes of all time. He had 70 games in which he got a hit, and then a game in which he didn't get a hit, and then another 70 games in which he got a hit.
Wow.
So he got a hit in all but one out of 140 games. A phenomenal record. Well, I've learned that just now. What happened was, in Honolulu in 1944,
Take a sip.
there were various professional baseball players in uniform, and I thought it would be an interesting story. What are these fellows doing? Joe DiMaggio was a staff sergeant. He had 4 stripes on his sleeve, the same 4 stripes that I had. We were both staff sergeants. And we found a fellow named Gordon, who was a shortstop for the New York Yankees. He was busy mopping a latrine. That was his job. So we got a picture of him doing that. And I thought, okay, now we'll get Joe DiMaggio, make a nice little feature. So I went over, it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he was sound asleep. I was rather shocked. I mean, what's a staff sergeant doing? He had me having a nap at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And although he presumably had human privacy, I felt my time was precious, I couldn't waste it. So I just woke him up to tell him I wanted to interview him. He was absolutely wild with anger. He said, I am going to tell my general on you. And he did. And although I already had a Purple Heart for combat wounds, I was hit back into combat. And then the Army came to the Herald Tribune and said, we will give you a proper layout on Joe. What he's doing is he's playing baseball, which is entertaining the pilots. It's good for morale, so it's a real contribution to the war effort. He's not getting shot at, but he is helping morale, and that's a major contribution. And so they gave us a layout of him marching in parade. So it worked out. We got the interview on Joe, but unfortunately, I got a new trip into the battlefront.
Wow. Excellent, Pop. That's a good one. The other story that you mentioned recently was, I think you were visiting Albert Schweitzer, but the discussion about the gorillas and going out and being careful about disturbing the gorillas at certain times. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, I went to see Dr. Schweitzer on the equator in Africa. He was a saint in my mind. He grew up in Alsace-Lorraine, the area in northern France, which some years was French, some years was German. And he grew up so sick and tired of these national conflicts and the fighting that he wanted to go to a place somewhere on earth where he could do peaceful work. And he had a doctorate of philosophy, a doctorate of music, a doctorate of medicine, of divinity, 3 doctorates, and at age 30 he decided that he really needed 1 more doctorate, and it should be medicine, so that he could make some practical contribution to physical well-being. And then he just loved to study. He found that it's a lot harder to get a doctorate when you're in your 30s than it is when you're in your 20s, when your mind is is in better shape. But he got it at age 38. And so with 4 doctorates, he went to the most benighted place on earth, the African jungle on the equator. And a child, 8-year-old child in one of the army families had heard about him, and she wrote a letter saying she wanted to give him $5, something of that sort. But she didn't know how to get it to him. So the Air Force, thinking it was a good PR stunt, said, why don't you come and hand it to him yourself? We'll send a plane down there, and you can bring your $5 and hand it to him, and we'll bring the press along if they want to come. So I went along with them. And when we landed at Lambarene, in the middle of the jungle, I had to cross a jungle river to get to his clearing, and got into a dugout canoe, and they paddled me across, and he was waiting on the stands on the other side, took me by the elbow, found out I was an American, and said, oh, well, you know, there was an American here in this clearing before I got here. That was back in 1910. So he was trying to find some way to connect the two of us, and that was the way he thought of it. So I asked people what was going on, and his daughter said, we have a big favor to ask of you. Don't ask him how his book is coming. He wrote a book called Reverence for Life. Don't kill any living thing. Every life is so rare, so precious, even a housefly. And there was one story that he had little holes in his screens, so that if you found a fly inside, you didn't let it deliver a disease to you, you just poked it out through the little holes.
They were little trap doors, right?
Little trap doors.
Yeah, yeah.
John Gunther wrote about them in one of his books, so I must say I didn't actually observe it. But in any case, I said, what's it like? And they said, well, he wrote that book, Reverence for Life, but now he wants to write a book of higher philosophy, but he never will. It just isn't coming. He's 88 years old, and that's not going to be. So please don't say, how's your book coming? Because we have an agreement here never to say that. So I said, well, what does happen? They said, well, you know, every night he plays a little music for us, drawing on his doctorate of music. And he gives us a little homily, drawing on his doctorate of divinity. And I said, well, last night, for instance, what was the theme? The bushes right around here are filled with gorillas. And what he said was, I want to tell you 2 things. First, don't go out through the bushes into the jungle, because you might meet a gorilla. And after I finish telling you that, and you've ignored it, and you do go out through the bushes, and you do meet a gorilla, look him right in the eye and back away slowly.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Now, speaking of books that, you know, might never get written, what do you have there underneath the glossy All right.
Well, I've published 6 books, one on post-war Europe, one on the Vatican, one on the American Catholics, one on the Soldiers magazine, Yank magazine of World War II, one on a guide to Rome. But there was one I wrote that I so far have not yet been able to get published. And that was experiences as a journalist of the Fourth Estate, the fourth leg on which democracy rests. There's the executive branch, the judiciary, the legislative, three branches of government, and then there's the free press, the four necessary legs of democracy. And so that's what the book was. And my grandson, Christopher, noticed the manuscript sitting there up in the attic, and he then went and published one copy of it. He just fed it into a computer. And so, although I still hope to get it published and printed, even if I don't, Christopher has provided one copy of it.
And how old are you now?
Right now I'm 94 and I'm looking to the next 10 years with excitement.
All right, good. Excellent, Pop. Now, another story I like you have told, I don't think we've gotten on videotape yet, is dinner time at your house growing up, and how your mother had to get the food on the table.
Well, I was the firstborn, and then 10 months later my sister Rita was born, and then regularly, once a year, Alice came, then Grace, then Rosemary, and after Rosemary, Eileen came, and then she was followed by Ruth, and not long after that, although I think that time there was a gap of about 5 years, Doris was born, and I was by then 17 and in despair because I'd always wanted to have a brother. All I had was just 7 sisters. But then, to my joy, my brother Ed was born. And so we were a family of 9, which seemed to be enough until a few years later my brother Bobby was born. Then we were a family of 10. And I was in college by then. I had 15 cents a day for food between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. One of the biggest things of the day was deciding whether I would have a bowl of soup and a roll and butter, or pancakes and a glass of milk. That's where I could get 15 cents. So every day I chose one or the other, but it was never enough. I wondered what it would like not to be hungry. So when we were at table, I was always served first, and then Rita and on down the line, my mother. And I would always eat very quickly because I wanted to get seconds. And that was on my mind as the food gradually diminished. And my mother finally reprimanded me one day and said, "Your father hasn't had anything to eat yet, and you want seconds."
Wow.
So I was a little more inhibited after that, but still hungry for the seconds.
Now, you talked about your grandmother, your mother's mother, and how she, her approach to child raising and the assumption of mischief on the part of the children, even though she wasn't home.
Well, my grandfather died in 1904, and this is the bill from the undertaker.
Wow.
They charged $65. Well, They charged $70 for the embalmment, and in all, his funeral cost $150. I still have that.
Wow.
So that my grandmother was a single person then, starting in 1904, 10 years before I was born, and she supported herself by scrubbing floors in office buildings, and
In New York? Or where?
in New York. And the story in the family, and I think I got it through my mother, was that she would come up home each day and say to my mother and my Aunt Carrie and my Uncle Pete and Aunt Minnie, the 4 children, that she didn't know what bad things they'd done during the day, and it was unlikely they would report them to her. So she would spank the 4 of them for the appropriate punishment. Whatever it was that they shouldn't have done, that she would never know about. She had a rather stern Germanic approach to life, but she was very loving to me. And I remember when I would go visiting her, she had a little red wagon on wheels, and she would send me up to Wilkinson Avenue to go to all the Italian grocery stores and ask them for the sheaths of corn when the corn
Shucked.
was shucked. They didn't want the leftovers, but she wanted them. And sometimes I'd find them out in the back in a puddle, all muddy, but I'd pick them up anyway and put them in my little wagon, take them back. She would clean them off, dry them, and then make mattresses out of them. And so I slept on those mattresses, but they always poked through the little shop.
Is that right?
That's right.
This is your grandmother?
Yeah.
Fascinating. And what was her name?
Anna Schneider.
Wow.
Her name was Schneider, and that of course is what this funeral notice says. But my mother was very anxious to be an American girl, so she shortened it to Snyder, which she thought was a little less foreign.
Now let me ask you something. What do you know about your grandfather, Grandpa Schneider?
Of course, as I say, he died 104 years ago, and 10 years before I was born. But I do know that he and possibly his brother were cigar makers. That was their job.
Interesting. That's all you know?
You know.
Okay. And what about your father's family? What do you know about them?
Well, I knew my grandmother, my father's mother. She came to the United States around 1860, at a time when Ireland had suffered a terrible plague, famine, and a lot of Irish came fleeing famine to the United States. And she arrived, but she had her own strong dignity, and a fellow named Henry Clayton asked her for her hand in marriage. Well, Henry Clayton had arrived some years earlier as an orphan. He landed on the docks in Boston. His parents presumably killed by disease on shipboard, my great-grandparents, for all I know.
Okay.
And a family in Keene, New Hampshire, the Claytons, a Protestant family, adopted him and raised him as a Protestant, Catholic Protestant child. And Mary Barrett said, "I will accept your hand in marriage, but on condition that you take back your religion and your name. You must cease being Henry Clayton and resume being Henry McGurn, a Catholic." So swept away with his passion for my grandmother. He gave in on all points. And I, of course, never knew him. But I did know her. And she was a very loving, devoted person. She named my father William Barrett McGurn. Her name was Mary Barrett. And I became William Barrett Jr., just as son Bill is William Barrett III. And as Bill has said, I have news for everybody, there will never be a William Barrett the fourth. He named his son Edward.
Oh. Okay, let's go over to Jan McGurn, who's just walked in the room, looking lovely as always. How are you, Mom?
I don't care for that.
I wanted you to talk about you were having some great stories the other night about your family and the growing up years with Tano, but your father left when you were very young, right?
Very young.
And so tell me just a little bit about that. I mean, what you knew of your father.
I knew very little of him. What I know of him is basically painful. There's some parts I know that I remember sort of coming home when I was very young. I remember running down the front path to greet him and having him pick me up. And that felt awfully good. And then my brother and I, part of the custody rights, were invited to see him for 2 weeks. He had a farm. He also had a new wife and 2 stepdaughters. And I think I was about 4 or 5 at the time. And I had rather a queasy stomach. And frankly, his wife and 2 daughters gave me a queasier stomach. And I said, I've got to go home. And he said, all right, I'll take you home, but you can come back. And I remember him tying my shoes, or buckling, or whatever he did. And my brother said, well, if she's going, I have to go too. And I remember him saying to my brother, if you go, you can't come back. And so, with those kind of words, he had a car with a rumble seat. And we sat in the rumble seat all the way home, and he and his new wife. And we lived in a place called Sunnybank Cottage. And we were up there with my mother, and he was down the driveway. And he looked at my mother. I think I remember this. I'm almost sure I do, but he said, you've won.
You said that before, I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Where was that?
That was in Long Beach, Indiana, which was just about 50 miles outside of Chicago.
Okay, so that's where you were as a very little girl.
Mm-hmm. And my father was a lawyer in Chicago.
Okay.
So.
And his name was William Francis McLaughlin?
Mm-hmm. He was the 3rd. I think my brother's the 4th. I think that was the end of that too.
But isn't your brother William Fitzmaurice McLaughlin?
No, my brother is W.F. McLaughlin III.
Oh, so he is named directly after your father.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so tell me then what happened after that. Did you leave Indiana?
We did. We stayed. I think we moved into Chicago for a year, as I remember. And my mother was a very good friend of my father's sister, Aunt Harriet. But I mean, after the divorce, that fell apart. So my mother had a friend who got her a position in Washington, in the government. So we moved to Washington. Pauline, who was our housekeeper, looker after, and my brother and me. We moved to Washington. And I grew up in Washington.
Yeah. In the Westchester, right?
At the Westchester Apartments. I went to Western High School and Visitation Junior College. And then I got a job on the Washington Times-Herald. And that, of course, was a life-changing experience.
And tell me about that.
Oh, it was a wonderful time. I remember I walked in and you couldn't do that now. I mean, everything is too mechanized, motorized, you can't get past the front door. But I did. And so I walked in and they said, yes, young lady, what are you doing? And I had a very good friend whose father was the head of the Hearst Bureau. And my dream, and I've met a lot of his friends, and my dream was to be in the newspaper business. I also had an uncle who was in the newspaper business.
So let me qualify that. Who are those two people you just mentioned? You're a friend of your father's?
No, my uncle was my mother's brother.
Okay.
And Dave Sentner was Joy Sentner's father, and she was my best friend.
Okay.
So Dave said, well, I can't do much for you, but he said, just go in and present yourself. As I say, you couldn't do that now. But I did go in, and they directed me to the accounting department. They said, we were looking for a job, and I said, yes. So that, of course, did not appeal to me. So I went to the elevators, and I looked at the various departments. It's one said editorial. So that's where I went. And I was offered a job as a women's page editor, women's page assistant. Well, that girl was going on vacation for 2 weeks. They said we could only offer you the job for 2 weeks. I said, I'll take it. So those 2 weeks were heavenly. I just went all over the place. Finally, they were asking me to write captions, and it was wonderful.
Wow.
Then the assistant, about the end of that time, the assistant to the managing editor came to me and he said, we'd like to have you in our office. And I said, well, I don't want to be a secretary. And they said, well, no, you'll be doing various other jobs too, but you will be doing some secretarial work. I didn't take shorthand or any of the qualifying things. So I did go in. They said, well, no, that'll be fine. I said, well, could I have some time on the city desk? Because I'd, just fallen in love with that whole reporting business. And I had some nerve because I didn't know how to do a thing that was practical, like typing in shorthand. So he said, well, yeah, I think we can guarantee you that. So I went in, and it's a long story from there. That's another chapter.
Well, let me ask you about the one story that you covered with, who was the guy who flew around the world?
Alistair Lang.
Yeah.
He was with the British Air Force.
Yeah.
And I was set to cover the arrival of the British Air Force. And the arrival consisted of a big cocktail party. So I and my photographer went out to cover it. And I met Alistair Lang, who was the Corps commander. And he was tall, very good looking. And so we got to chatting, and he said, well, how would you like to go flying with us tomorrow? They were going to go in formation around the eastern part of the country as part of Air Force's Day. And I, gleefully said, oh, I'd love that. Never having any idea that anything further would come of it. So we got in the car, and my photographer, Paul Denny, he said, by the way, you did call that story in, didn't you? Well, I had not. I was a little too occupied with Alistair Lang. So he was very protective. I had wonderful photographers, and they were very protective. They knew I was trying to break into it, and they were very, very good to me. So we got back, and the city editor gave me holy hell. So anyway, I had to sit down and write the story, which they didn't use because I was so flustered. So the next morning, I went in, and the city editor, the day city editor, was funny. He said, "You're being picked up in a half an hour." And I said, "What for?" And they said, "Well, didn't they tell you that you were going to be part of Air Force's Day?" I said, "Yeah, but I didn't take it very seriously." He said, "Well, they're going to pick you up in about a half an hour." So that happened.
Wow.
And we flew all around the country, and Alistair Lang was a dream, and we had a wonderful time. Then he went back to England, and I went on with my job.
Wow. Now, you eventually married one of the editors. Tell me about how that transpired.
I went into his office for that job, for the secretarial job with Jeff Morgan.
What was his name? What was his name?
Mason Peters. And so I went into his office, and I sat outside of the office. There were double offices. Mike Flynn, the day editor, and Mason Peters, the night editor. And Jeff Morgan was Mason's assistant. So we got very, very close. I mean, it was a very close corporation. We discussed all the aspects of the city desk and the personnel. I mean, I just occasionally, not occasionally, but eventually worked my way into that. And so it would be quite regular at 6 o'clock when Mason came in. Jeff and he and I would go in and confab on the day's workings and the gossip and the so forth, and there was a lot of it in that city room.
Where was that office?
15th and H.
Okay.
In fact, the building is still standing.
Okay.
So we went in, and finally, I got on the city desk for a half a day. I would go there. And the rest is sort of history. I mean, Mason and I got to know we all got to know one another. And finally it came to pass that he had said that he would like to be more friendly with me. And I said, well, you're married at the moment. I don't think I said at the moment. But I said, well, you're married, and I just can't do that. It's a funny story. I mean, it's a strange story. So eventually he did get a divorce, and we were married. It was about 2 years after I came to the paper.
Well, at least he, unlike John McCain, didn't put in for a marriage license while he was married.
No, he did not.
Tell me, if you can, about how the death of Sissy Patterson transpired and the subsequent inheritance of the paper.
What happened was that a very good friend of mine, her name is Adrienne McGurn, and her then fiance, and Mason and I were going to the beach. One day, he took the day off, and we went down to Rehoboth.
Okay.
And so we came back. My mother was standing in the door of our apartment waiting for me to come home. And she said, Mason just called. He had dropped me off. Well, no, I dropped him off at the paper and brought the car home because I was going to go back and meet him later. And she said, Mason has just called, and Sissy Patterson has just died. And he wants you to come right back down to the paper. So I did. And we went to the mansion.
Which was on DuPont Circle?
DuPont Circle.
Which still stands.
Yes, yes. It's now called the Washington Club.
Right.
And other things. So we went down there, and there was a great deal of funeral arrangements and hoopla, and then it came to pass that we knew that it was publicized that she had left her newspaper. She had left her newspaper to 7 of her top executives, one of whom was Mason Peters.
Fascinating.
Did I say goodbye to her?
Yes.
She did.
She's gone. She's already out the door.
Hello?
She's gone.
What's her name? I forget.
It's okay. Myra.
Myra. I was
I'll
going to say
tell-
goodbye to her. She's going to Europe.
Mom says goodbye. It's okay. No problem. No problem.
No, we want to pay her.
She'll call you later.
No, but I need to pay her, darling.
I paid her.
He paid her.
Did you pay her twice?
No.
Oh, she's got to have 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Call her back. 'Cause
All right.
she's due another